The matchmaker's letter promised a young Japanese bride, and it lied. The woman who stepped off the stage in Cedar Springs was 30 years old, plainly dressed, and carrying a single lacquered box she never let out of her sight. A widower rancher waiting by his buckboard expected a girl half a world away to fix a house that had been falling apart since his wife died. What he got was someone the whole town had already decided was too old and too foreign to be any use at all. Stay with me until the end to see how the woman nobody wanted became the wife he couldn't live without, and hit that like button so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The stage from Cheyenne had been 3 days of dust and rutted road, and it set Suzu down at the Cedar Springs Depot, just past noon on a Thursday in May of 1883. The town was barely a town, a single street of pine storefronts leaning into the wind, a saloon, a mercantile, a smithy, throwing smoke into the hard blue sky. She stood on the packed earth platform with the lacquered box in one hand and a long cloth-wrapped bundle in the other, and every man within sight stopped to look. She was small-framed and thin in a way that spoke of the journey rather than delicacy, her jet-black hair pinned in a traditional Japanese knot, her almond-shaped dark eyes taking in the whole street without settling on anyone. Beneath a dust-coated trailcoat she wore a plain indigo kimono and not a stitch of Western clothing, her fair skin and high cheekbones catching the light in a way that didn't belong to this country. That alone told the town she hadn't come to disappear into it. Hank Calloway stood by his buckboard across the street. He was taller than the letter had suggested, broad across the chest, with a face that grief had worn down to its bones, and he had expected the girl from the matchmaker's description, someone in her early 20s, docile, grateful for the crossing. He got a woman of 30 who looked back at him the way a man looks at an equal he hasn't yet decided to trust. The matchmaker's letter had said young. Suzu's own letter, sent against the matchmaker's wishes, had said 30, skilled in compo medicine and household management, and passed over for marriage more times than she cared to count. She hadn't begged for the match. She had only stated the truth and let him choose. He crossed the street. Up close he smelled of horse and wood smoke and the iron tang of saddle tack, his hands scarred across the knuckles in the way of a man who fixes things himself because there's no one else to do it. He didn't smile or offer his hand, just looked at the lacquered box, then at the long bundle, then at her face. "You're the one from Kyoto." She inclined her head, a single small motion. "I am Suzu." That was all. No surprise on his face that she was older than the advertisement, no apology for the lie in the letter, no performance of gratitude from either of them. Something passed between them that wasn't love and wasn't trust, closer to recognition, the kind that comes when two people have both already accepted the worst outcome anyone could hand them and are now standing on a dirt platform taking each other's measure because the alternative is to give up. He took the box from her hands. He didn't take the long bundle. She kept that. He loaded the box onto the buckboard, the work vehicle with its flat bed and splintered rail, built for hauling feed and fence posts, and not for carrying a bride in comfort. She climbed up beside him without being helped, the wrapped bundle across her knees, and he clicked the reins, and the team pulled them out of Cedar Springs toward the open range. The town watched them go, and the town had already made up its mind, a foreign woman past her prime, bought by a desperate man. What the town didn't know, what Hank didn't yet know, was that the lacquered box held the medicine her grandmother had practiced in the old district of Kyoto for 40 years, and that the long bundle held something else entirely. The land outside Cedar Springs was recovering from a dry spring that had turned the grass the color of straw and left the creek beds cracked. Fence posts leaned where the frost had heaved them out of the ground, and a section of wire had sagged into the mud where a steer had pushed through and not been chased back. Hank drove with one hand and counted the damage with his eyes, Another section down, another calf probably gone, another week of holding the ranch together by his teeth while 3 children waited at home for a mother who was never coming back. Suzu watched him count and said nothing, because she had learned long ago that the first thing a stranger needs isn't advice. It's the proof that someone sees the size of what they're carrying. The Lone Pine Ranch sat in a shallow valley 2 hours out of town, its buildings drawn around a spring that fed a thin creek. The house was pine and sod, low to the ground, built to keep the wind out rather than to please the eye. It was clean, and that was the first thing Suzu noticed, because it told her more than anything the children would later say someone had been keeping this house by force of will alone. Hank tied the team and carried her box inside without ceremony. The door opened onto a single room that served as kitchen and parlor, with a stove against the far wall, a table scarred from use, and a hearth that held cold ash. A kettle sat on the stove top, cold. 3 pairs of small boots stood in a row by the door, the smallest pair no bigger than her hand. And on a peg beside the hearth, a woman's shawl hung untouched, the wool still carrying the faint shape of shoulders that would never fill it again. The mother was gone, but the mother's objects remained, placed where she had left them as though she might walk back in and need them. The children were in the back room. Martha, the eldest at 11, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and a face set hard enough to stop a man twice her age. She had been running this house for a year, cooking what she could, dressing the little ones, lying awake, listening for the cough that had taken her mother, and she wasn't about to hand it to a stranger who couldn't say the children's names the way their mother had said them. Behind her, a boy of 8 named Sam leaned against the wall, quiet and watchful, with the stillness of a child who has stopped speaking much because no one had the energy to listen. And behind Sam, half hidden by a chair, a girl of 4 called Birdie watched Suzu with eyes too large for her small round face. Hank set the box down in the room that would be Suzu's, a narrow space off the main room with a cot and a window facing the ridge. He didn't call it home. He called it where you'll sleep, and the distance in those 3 words was the whole of what he was willing to give. She set the lacquered box on the dresser and didn't open it, leaning the wrapped bundle in the corner where she could see it from the cot. Then she came back out and stood in the doorway, the way her grandmother had taught her to enter a sick room, hands still, weight centered, waiting to be shown where the need was, rather than imposing herself on it. No one offered her a seat. Martha didn't look at her. Sam didn't speak. Birdie edged 1 step closer and then stopped, as if she had used up all her courage for the day. Hank told the children her name, and it sounded wrong in his mouth, the syllables bent by a tongue that had never shaped them. He told them she was here to help. He didn't say she was their new mother, because he wasn't a man who made promises he couldn't keep, and he didn't yet know what she was. Night came on fast the way it does on the high plains, the sky going from blue to iron to black in the space of an hour. Suzu lit the lamp on the table, a kerosene lantern that threw a flickering amber light across the walls rather than the steady white beam a city house would have had. In that unsteady glow, the room was what it was, a place where a family had been and was now only half present, the missing half measured in a cold kettle and a shawl no one would touch, and 3 children who had forgotten how to be quiet, because quiet was the sound their mother made when she was dying. Through the thin wall, Suzu heard Sam cough, a small dry sound, the kind a child makes in his sleep when the chest is tired. She lay still and listened. It was nothing yet, because she hadn't examined him, but her grandmother had taught her that a cough in a house where a fever has already taken one life is never just a cough, and the seed of worry planted itself in her chest and stayed there. She didn't wait for permission. Before dawn the next morning, while the house was still dark and the children still asleep, Suzu moved through the kitchen the way a surgeon moves through a room she has been called into. She built the fire, sorted the pantry, found the flour that had gone weevil, and set it aside, and she cooked, not anything fancy but correct food, the kind that says, "Someone competent is now in charge of this kitchen," a meal to hold a working man and 3 growing children through a hard morning. The geometry of how she moved told the story before anyone tasted it. Her hands sure, her steps short, nothing wasted. Martha came out when the smell reached her, and her face went tight. She looked at the stove, at the table set for 5, at the stranger standing where her mother used to stand, and she didn't say thank you. What she said was that she could have done it herself. Suzu didn't argue. She lifted the edge of a cloth on the counter and showed the loaf Martha had tried to bake the day before. The bottom black, the center raw, the kind of bread an 11-year-old makes when she's been taught by hunger and not by anyone with the time to teach her. Suzu set it aside and slid her own loaf onto the table without a word about the burned one, and the silence did the work a speech would have failed at, Martha's throat moving once before she sat down. Sam ate without looking up. Bertie ate with both hands. Hank came in last, washed, his hair still wet, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw the table. He had not expected that. He sat and he ate, and didn't compliment the food, because a man like him counts a full stomach as evidence enough, and he watched Suzu across the table the way he had watched her on the platform, recalibrating. That afternoon he took her into Cedar Springs for supplies, because the ranch couldn't wait, and because the town was going to see her sooner or later, and he wanted it on his terms. The Mercantile was the center of what passed for public life in Cedar Springs, a low building that smelled of leather and dry goods and the sweat of men who had ridden in from the range. When Suzu walked in behind Hank, wearing her kimono beneath the trail coat, the conversation at the counter stopped the way a clock stops when the spring breaks. Burl Hargrove was leaning on the counter. He ran the Bar H, the bigger spread to the north, and for 2 years he had been working on Hank to sell his water access, the spring that fed the Lone Pine Creek being the only reliable water between the 2 ranches in a dry year. Hank had refused. Burl was a large man with a voice that carried, the kind who's used to being the loudest authority in any room. He looked Suzu up and down and smiled the kind of smile that isn't a greeting. "Hank, I see the mail brought you something past its shelf date." It was said for the room. Suzu heard it and didn't flinch. She had been called worse in her own country by her own family, and she had learned that the only answer a remark like that deserves is the continued steadiness of the person it was aimed at. She looked at Burl once, as her grandmother had taught her to look at a man who was testing whether you'll break, and then she turned back to the goods on the shelf and let the silence stand. Hank's jaw set hard enough to whiten the muscle along it, but he said nothing, not yet. On the ride home, the buckboard loaded with sacks of flour and salt and wire, Hank spoke to her for the first real time since the platform. He didn't apologize for Burl or explain the town. He kept his eyes on the road and said one thing, low and even. "The children have lost one mother. Don't make them think they're getting one who won't stay." It was a warning from a man who had watched the woman he married die, and wasn't going to let his children open that door again unless the person on the other side of it proved she wouldn't walk out. Suzu listened, and she didn't promise, because promises made to a frightened man are worth less than the work that backs them up. A week in, a ranch hand named Wally split his forearm open on a hoof knife when a colt jerked against the hobbles. The cut was deep, laid open to the pale yellow of the fat under the skin, and on the frontier a wound like that goes septic in 2 days and costs a man his arm, if not his life. Doc Parsons was a half-day's hard ride east in the next settlement, and by the time anyone fetched him, the damage would be done. Hank was binding the arm with a strip of shirt when Suzu came out of the house carrying the lacquered box, opened for the first time. Inside, laid into fitted grooves in the lacquered wood, were small packets of prepared herbs folded in paper, each one labeled in a hand too fine and small to belong to anyone under 70. Beside them lay a row of needles so fine they caught no light at all, and a folded sheet of paper covered in characters Hank couldn't read. The box smelled of camphor and dried root and something older than both. It had been her grandmother's, and her grandmother's grandmother before that, carried out of Kyoto when Suzu left, the only inheritance a woman doctor in Japan could pass to a granddaughter. The world had decided was too old to be wanted. Suzu knelt beside Wally without asking permission and cleaned the wound with boiled water and a clean cloth, working fast and without fuss. She chose 2 packets and set them to steep in a tin cup of hot water from the cook fire, measuring the herbs by eye in proportions that were fixed, not improvised, the way the tradition demanded. Then she packed a poultice of the wet herbs into the cut, bound it clean, and told Wally in a low voice to keep it dry and drink the steeped cup before he slept. What she didn't do was announce what she was doing or why it would work. She did it. Hank watched her hands. He had not expected that. He had sent for a wife, someone to keep house and mind children, and what had stepped off the stage was a woman whose hands moved around a wound the way his own moved around a foaling mare, with the calm of someone who has done the hard thing enough times that the hard thing has stopped being hard. The ranch hand healed in 4 days instead of the 2 weeks a cut like that usually took, and by the end of the week every man on the Lone Pine knew that the foreign woman the town had called too old could close a wound faster than the doctor half a day east. Word travels among working men the way water travels downhill, and it reached the bunkhouse before it reached town. The shift was small but real. The hand stopped staring at Suzu's kimono in the mornings and started nodding to her instead. One brought her a jar of honey as a thank you, set it on the porch without a word, and walked off. On the frontier, being useful isn't the same as being wanted, but it's the first thing that keeps a stranger from being driven out, and the surest way to survive a place that doesn't want a stranger is to become valuable enough that it can't afford to lose her. The children were slower to move than the hands. Martha still guarded the kitchen like a fort. Sam still barely spoke. But Bertie, the 4-year-old who had watched Suzu from behind a chair the first night, crossed the yard one afternoon while Suzu was hanging washing and held out a single yellow wildflower pulled up by the roots. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with the flower in her fist and her eyes enormous, and Suzu knelt down and accepted it with both hands as her grandmother had taught her to accept a gift, with the gravity the giver deserves. Bertie sat down beside her in the dirt and didn't leave for an hour. It was the first crack in the wall the children had built around their mother's place, and it came from the smallest side of it, the way cracks usually do. Then Sam's cough came back. It was worse. By the end of the 2nd week, the cough had settled into Sam's chest and wouldn't leave. Suzu hadn't examined him yet, because the boy flinched when she came near, and Hank hadn't asked her to, and she wouldn't force herself on a frightened child in a house that wasn't yet hers to run. But she listened through the wall at night, the way her grandmother had listened to the houses on her street in Kyoto, and she knew the sound was changing from dry to wet. The 3rd night, Hank was sitting up with the boy. A lamp burned on the shelf, kerosene amber, flickering across the low ceiling, and Sam was hot to the touch and breathing in short, shallow pulls. Hank sat on the edge of the cot, with his elbows on his knees, and the look of a man watching the same road he had watched before, the one that ended in a grave on the ridge beside his wife. The grief cracked open then, not in a speech, but in 3 broken sentences, spoken to a woman he barely knew, because she was the only other adult awake, and the dark makes a man say things he wouldn't say in daylight. He said he had watched this happen before, and that he couldn't watch it again. He said, please. It was the first time he had asked her for anything. Suzu didn't answer right away. She went to the parlor and came back with 2 boxes, the lacquered one, and a smaller wooden one she had noticed on the high shelf the first day, the one Hank hadn't opened since his wife died, and she didn't open his. She set it on the table beside him and asked him to, but he couldn't, his hand going to the lid and stopping, and she didn't push, because she had sat with her own grandmother the night she died, and she knew that some boxes aren't meant to be opened by anyone but the person who closed them. She opened hers instead, all the way she hadn't done even for Wally, and told Hank then, plainly, why she had been too old to marry. It wasn't a flaw in her, it was a refusal. She had been promised once before, at 23, to a merchant in Yokohama who wanted a younger face and a quieter woman, and when her family asked her to smile and agree, she had refused to be ashamed of her age, the way the matchmaker later lied for her in the letter to Hank. That refusal cost her every match her family arranged after, until they stopped arranging them and sent her across the water to a stranger who wanted a bride no one else had wanted. And the box, she said, was her grandmother's. Her grandmother had been a Kampo doctor in Kyoto for 40 years, and the village had told her too that she was too much, too old, too stubborn to marry well. The village had been wrong, because it came to her door in the dark for 40 years anyway. The woman nobody wanted to marry becoming the woman nobody could do without when the fevers came. Inside were the needles her grandmother had used, the herbs mixed to the formulas her grandmother had fixed, and the paper in her grandmother's hand. Hank didn't say anything for a long time. He looked at the box, and at the boy, and at the woman who hadn't been sent because she was unwanted, but who had come because she wouldn't pretend to be less than she was. The match hadn't been a charity. It had been her choice, made on her terms, by a woman who would rather cross an ocean than apologize for her own worth. For the first time since the platform, he looked at her without the wall up, and what he saw wasn't a convenience or a stranger or a woman past her time. He saw the only person in 3 territories who wasn't afraid of the sound coming out of his son's chest. By morning, Sam was burning. The fever climbed over 2 days the way a river climbs in a spring thaw, slow and then all at once. Sam's skin went from warm to hot to a dry heat that radiated off him like a stove, and his breathing thickened until every pull of air carried a wet rattle deep in the chest. Doc Parsons arrived on the second afternoon, a lean man with a worn bag and the careful manner of someone who has delivered more bad news than good. He had tended Hank's wife through this same kind of fever a year and a half before, and he had dosed her the only way he knew, and she had died on the 5th morning. Now he stood over the boy and opened the same bag and reached for the same answers. Laudanum to ease the strain, bleeding to balance the humors, a shallow cut at the wrist to let the bad blood out. Warm cloths, rest, and prayer if the family had any to spare. Doc Parsons wasn't a careless man or a cruel one, just doing the best he knew with the medicine of a country that hadn't yet learned to read a fever as anything other than an imbalance to be drained. The trouble was that his best had already failed this family once, in this same room, at this same bed. Suzu watched, without contradicting the doctor in front of the children or the hands, because undermining a man in his own authority in front of people who trust him is a cruelty she wouldn't perform, even to be right. But she began her own work in the margins, the way her grandmother had worked alongside the town physician in Kyoto without ever correcting him in public, using the 4 methods her grandmother had drilled into her until they were automatic. She looked at the boy, the color of his skin, the film at the corners of his eyes, the coat on his tongue, then listened to the rasp and rattle of his breathing, the wet catch at the bottom of each exhale, and asked him questions in a low voice about where it hurt and when it started and whether the heat was worse at night. And when Doc Parsons stepped out to wash his instruments, she pressed her fingers to Sam's abdomen in the Kampo way, reading through the wall of the belly what the surface of the skin wouldn't say, the way her grandmother had taught her to read a body's pattern, the way a tracker reads a trail. Hank saw her do it. He saw her face change when her fingers found the right place. A small tightening around the eyes that wasn't fear but recognition, the look of someone who's found the shape of the problem and now knows which of her tools fits it. She had matched the boy's pattern to a formula she carried, but only just. Where the ranch hand's wound had been a simple thing to clean and close, this was a whole body pattern, the kind her grandmother had said you treat as one garment and not as separate threads, because a fever is in the chest, in the gut, and the skin, and the spirit all at once, and the formula has to hold all of it. In the kitchen, Martha broke. The 11-year-old who had held the house together for a year sat down at the table and put her face in her hands. The sound she made small and terrible, the sound of a child who has been pretending to be grown for too long. She told Suzu she was afraid Sam was going to die and that it would be her fault, because she hadn't watched him close enough, because she hadn't been the mother she was supposed to be. Suzu didn't tell her it wouldn't happen, because she wouldn't lie to a child about a fever, and told Martha the truth instead, hard and kind at once. The fever wasn't anyone's fault, she said, and watching alone had never saved anyone, her own grandmother having lost patience until she learned to let other hands help. Then she asked Martha to help her, not to stand aside, but to help. Martha lifted her face. She didn't cry again. She nodded once. The small, fierce nod of a girl deciding to stop guarding a fort and start holding a line with someone beside her, and that nod was the turn the whole house had been waiting for, the moment the dead mother's place stopped being a wall and became a door. Doc Parsons came back in from the porch drying his hands. He looked at the boy, looked at his watch, and asked to speak to Hank outside. On the porch, in the last of the light, he said it the way an honest man says a hard thing. The boy wasn't improving. The laudanum was holding the worst of it, but it wasn't turning the fever. He didn't have the means to do more than he was doing, and he was sorry, and he wouldn't lie about it because he had already lied once to this family by hope, and it hadn't helped. Hank stood on the porch and said nothing, and the silence between two men who had both watched a woman die was heavier than any words would have been. Then Hank went back inside and turned to Suzu. He didn't order her or beg. He asked the way a man asks when he has run out of every other kind of authority, and said her name the first time he had said it right, the syllables finally sitting in his mouth as if they belonged there. And he asked her to try. Night settles over the cabin, and the lamp burns amber on the low table, the flame jumping with every draft. Suzu lays out her tools the way her grandmother did, the packets of herbs in a row, the cup for steeping, the fine needles on a clean cloth in case the fever turns and she needs them. She works with the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome, the calm her grandmother carried into every sick room, the calm that isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to let the hands move while the fear stays still. She measures the herbs by eye, the fixed proportions her grandmother set down on the paper in the box, the same formula for this same pattern, not a guess, but a remembering. The tradition doesn't allow improvisation because a body in fever isn't a problem to be solved by invention, but a pattern to be matched to a tool that has already been proven. She steeps the cup and waits the time her grandmother taught her to wait, no longer, no shorter. And the smell that rises is bitter and green and old, the smell of the Kyoto sick room carried across an ocean into a Wyoming cabin. Hank stands in the doorway and doesn't come in. He watches her hands move over the cup and the boy, and the town's verdict sounds in his head like something a fool said a long time ago, because the woman the town dismissed is the only person in 3 territories whose hands are steady enough to hold his son's life in a cup of bitter tea. He had not expected her to be this still under this much weight. Suzu lifts Sam's head. He is barely awake, his eyes glassy and far away, but he opens his mouth when she tells him to, and she feeds him the medicine in small doses through the long hours of the night, a spoon at a time, waiting between each one for the breath to settle before she gives the next. Martha keeps the kettle hot on the stove, refilling the cup without being told, and the girl's face in the lamplight is set the way her father's is set, the same jaw, the same refusal to look away from a hard thing. Bertie sleeps on a blanket by the hearth, curled small, her fist closed around the hem of Suzu's kimono, where she grabbed it before she dropped off and wouldn't let go. For the first time since the mother died, the household moves as one body around the sick boy. The mother's absence is still in the room, in the shawl on the peg and the shape of the empty chair, but it isn't the only thing in the room anymore. There's the smell of the steeping herbs, and the sound of Martha pouring water, and the small steady motion of a stranger's hand feeding a child the medicine her grandmother made, and the quiet fact of a man standing in a doorway refusing to leave while his son breathes. Before dawn, the rattle eases. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens the way ice thaws on a south roof, the catch growing softer between one breath and the next, until Suzu notices it has been minutes since she heard the wet sound at all. Sam's skin cools under her palm, his breathing slows and deepens, and finds a rhythm it had lost. And in the gray light before the sun clears the ridge, he opens his eyes and asks for water in a voice so small it barely carries across the cot. Suzu holds the cup for him. She lets him drink. She says nothing. There's nothing to say that the cup isn't already saying, and her grandmother taught her that the work is the words, and the words after the work are only noise. Doc Parsons returns at first light, expecting to find the boy worse or gone, and stops in the doorway when he sees Sam sitting up against Suzu's arm, drinking. The doctor looks at the boy, then at Suzu, then at the empty cup on the table. He doesn't understand what she did, but he's an honest man and he won't deny what's in front of him. So he asks her, plainly, what was in the medicine. She tells him. A worn notebook comes out of his coat, and he writes it down, the herbs and the proportions, in a hand that shakes a little, and the look he gives her isn't defeat. It's the look of one kind of knowledge meeting another and recognizing it has something to learn. He asks her to show him the abdominal examination, and she does, and he writes that down too. By noon, the boy is asleep in a real sleep, the first in days, and the fever is broken. Word reached Cedar Springs by midday, carried by a hand riding in for supplies, and by the time Burl Hargrove heard it, he had already decided how to use it. Burl wasn't a man who let a good crisis go to spare. He rode out to the Lone Pine that afternoon with 2 of his men behind him, not to fight, but to apply pressure. The way a man pushes a fence post he wants to push over. The water rights question and the foreign wife question were the same question to him, whether Hank Calloway was fit to hold what he held, and Burl intended to make the town decide it on Saturday. Suzu heard the horses from the porch, where she was hanging the last of the washing, with Sam bundled in a blanket on a chair beside her, where she could watch his breathing. When she saw 3 riders come through the gate and recognized the man in front, she didn't go inside. She set down the washing and went to the corner of the porch, where the long cloth-wrapped bundle had been leaning since the day she arrived, and she unwrapped it. Inside was a naginata, a long pole arm with a curved blade at the end, the steel dark and old, and kept to an edge her grandmother had insisted on. It had been her grandmother's, the other half of what a woman doctor in the old country was expected to know, how to heal and how to stand. Suzu set the butt of the pole on the boards and let the blade rest across her shoulder, and she stood between the riders and the boy, not to fight, but to make it plain that crossing her would cost something the men across from her hadn't agreed to pay. Burl's men pulled up short. They had expected a woman in a kimono and a sick child, and an easy morning's work. They hadn't expected the stillness, the centered weight, the blade that caught the sun along its curve, or the eyes that looked at them the way a hunter looks at something that hasn't yet decided whether it's prey. Burl said something about Hank sending his wife to do his threatening for him. Suzu didn't answer. She didn't move. The men sat their horses and looked at each other until Burl turned his horse, because a man who rides up to menace a woman with a blade and a sick boy has already lost more than he can win, and he headed back to town to try the fight with words instead. Saturday came, and the town was full. The mercantile porch crowded, the air hot and dry and carrying the smell of horses and dust. Burl made his case loud and plain that Hank Calloway had let a foreign woman drive off the only doctor the county had by dosing his own son with strange medicine no honest man could name, and that a man who couldn't keep his own house in order couldn't be trusted with the water the whole valley shared in a dry year. He wasn't entirely wrong about the fear, and that was what made him dangerous, because a man with a grain of truth can turn a crowd further than a man with none. The town pressed in. Some agreed with Burl out of the old prejudice against anything they didn't recognize. Some agreed out of genuine worry about a medicine they couldn't read. Doc Parsons was there, leaned against the counter with his arms folded, and he let the noise build before he said a word, because an honest man doesn't interrupt a crowd until the crowd is ready to hear him. When they were, he said one line. The boy was dying. She saved him. He let the fact stand and didn't dress it up, because a fact that plain doesn't need dressing. Then Hank walked in. He had heard it, and he didn't explain himself to men who had already decided what they thought of his wife, just walked through the crowd to the back where Suzu stood alone, the woman who had never begged, not in Kyoto and not here, and who wasn't begging now. He stopped beside her without taking her hand and said it once, the way the men in this country say it when they mean it, more than they mean anything else in their lives. That's my wife. 3 words, and this time they weren't the lie they had been in the older stories, the convenient claim to save a stranger from a warrant. They were the truth. He said them, and the room reordered itself around them, because a man who will stand in front of his whole town and claim a woman the town has spent a month trying to shame is a man who has decided what he'll lose and what he'll keep, and the crowd can feel the difference between a bluff and a stake. Then he turned to Burl and talked about the water. Plainly, the land and the fence and the spring settled in a few hard sentences that had nothing to do with Suzu and everything to do with a man who finally had a reason to hold his ground. The personal claim and the property claim went in the same breath, because on the frontier, a man's wife and a man's water are defended the same way. Burl read the faces that had turned against him and backed off, not beaten in a fistfight, but outmaneuvered by a man who had found something worth standing for. Martha was there. She had come into town with them, the first time she had left the ranch in a year, and she watched her father claim the stranger her mother's place had been saved for, something in the girl letting go that had been holding on for a long time, though she didn't call Suzu Mama. What she did was smaller and harder. She walked across the dusty street and stood beside her. The ride home was quiet the way a house is quiet after a storm, the roof still standing. The buckboard that had carried a bride and a box and a bundle out to the ranch a month before carried a family back for the first time. Sam slept against Suzu's shoulder, still thin, still warm, but breathing easy. Bertie was already asleep in Martha's lap, and Martha sat with her hand on her sister's hair and didn't pull away when the buckboard jolted, and that was its own kind of turning. At the ranch, Hank hung his hat on the peg by the door. The mother's shawl still hung beside it, untouched. Suzu didn't take it down. She hung her own coat on the peg next to it, 2 garments side by side, neither one replacing the other. Sam reached for her hand as she tucked him in and said her name for the first time, soft and unsure, and she took it and held it the way her grandmother had held the hands of the children of Kyoto, with the whole weight of someone who's decided to stay. Martha set the table for 5 without being asked. Hank looked at Suzu across the table, that for a year had been set for 4 and was now set for 5. And the look that passed between them was the same recognition from the platform, deepened into something neither of them needed to name out loud. The woman nobody wanted, standing in a house that finally wanted her back. The kettle sang on the stove, and Sam slept on. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge, and the first real rain in months started to fall on a range that had been dying of thirst. And Suzu stood at the window and didn't move. She hadn't been chosen because she was young. She'd been chosen because she was enough. If this story moved you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far it travels.